Okay, awesome. Hey, well, lovely to see you both again. Um, yeah, these are exciting conversations, and I think there were a lot of like positive comments around the last chat we had. So I think there's people out there who find these useful. So as long as we enjoy doing it and people find it useful, why not? Um, I think people are much more interested to hear what Sophie has to say and think than either of us, Greg, and they're bored of us now. So there was a lot of good comments around like, who's that lady that you were talking with? Like, she's amazing, isn't she? Yep, we're going to do more of those conversations. So um, yeah, and we haven't particularly planned where we're going to go deliberately. So just going to kind of yeah, go with it and see what happens. So to kick us off, I haven't warned these guys about this, just throwing it in there. I've got a quote that I came across recently from Evan George, something he wrote in 2018, little blog, and just the first kind of opening sentences, which I just found interesting. I thought I'd just ask you guys to react to it, like your initial reactions to this statement from Evan back in 2018. So this is what he said. He said, "Words are troublesome for solution-focused practitioners. We choose to take them seriously. We assume that they are all that we have, and so we have become hypersensitized to words and how they are used. We assume that words are all that we have, so we have become hypersensitized to them and how they are used." What do you think
See,
to that?
I thought you were going to pick something more controversial than that. Then.
We'll get there. We'll get
Um,
there, I'm sure.
yeah, okay, good. I don't know. Yeah, I'd say yes. I don't know. It's just like because language is so important in the conversations we have. I mean, I think even outside of therapeutic sessions or the direct work of using it, I can't help but hear the language in other conversations that I have with people. And you think, oh, that's not a. You think about then I think the assumptions that are implied in that statement and things like that. Oh, that's not very nice, is it? So yeah, I think we're quite particular about our language for good reason because we know the impact it can have.
Yeah,
Mhm.
So
and li listening to that, I find maybe my brain is just being a little slow today, but I find almost the logic of it quite hard to follow because you call something troublesome and it has something of the flavor of, I mean, if we're going down the words route, that there's a
Mhm.
problem with words. And then I'm
Mm.
thinking, wait, hang on, but it's all about language, right? That we're playing.
Mm.
I think if I've understood the kind of the argument is that we need to pay huge attention to words, that what you do with language is crucial. And if you're not paying attention to the words, you are not paying attention to the thing that needs to be paid attention to. Is that is that what you're taking from it?
yeah, I think it's far more eloquent than what I just said. This is why people want to hear what Sophie has to say
No, I
about
just
it.
like
Yeah.
to be
But,
wordy.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
But it's so interesting because I don't,
Mm.
I think this isn't exclusively an SF thing. Like if I think about the sort of the language that is used, if I think about kind of, training as a psychologist, you think about, for example, the language used around autism. Are you an or autistic, or are you a person with autism? And
Mm.
there's throughout my training and throughout my kind of professional career, it's been really important to say, are you are a person first with an attribute rather
Mm.
than you are purely that. And it's the same, and this
Yeah.
feels like that at least I'm only becoming recently aware of it in the last sort of few years,
Mm.
thinking about the kind of the history of slavery. You read so much, and certainly at my education, people were referred to as slaves, and now the shift is rightly enslaved people. You are an enslaved
Mm.
woman, and it completely changes how you're able to see somebody because you see that there is a person to whom an action has happened, this enslavement, and you've then separated them and you have opened up conditions in which you can say, hang on, enslavement's not right, and it's not inherently part of that person. So I think,
Mm,
as a broad overview, I'm with him so far. Words are
yeah.
important.
Yeah, it's interesting. have a similar kind of wrestle or battle in the human trafficking kind of sector where I'm working, in working with with men who purchase sex, men who have perpetrated, violence against women. And it's words like perpetrator, right? It's words like sex buyer and perpetrator rather than a man who has perpetrated, abuse, or a man who has purchased sex. So that kinds of is, you know, it's another, it's a strange world I'm working in, but I think the concept is similar to what you described there.
Mm,
Yeah, language is powerful.
yeah.
Um,
And also, it expresses, I think, and probably this is extremely SF, it expresses your sense of possibility for that person. Because if you
mm,
describe a man who had
yeah.
committed this crime,
Mm,
then that can also be a man who doesn't commit that crime again.
mhm,
Whereas if that person is only the only language you use around them is
yeah.
related to that crime, you shut down a kind of future and then increased perhaps the likeliness. Because if you can only think of yourself as the sort of person that does that thing, well,
Mm,
what hope for
mm,
you then? Whereas if somebody is talking to you and using language which allows you to be other things,
mm,
then
yeah.
other things become possible.
Yeah. Does that apply on the flip side as well? With the word victim, when working with victims of, crime and abuse, do you think that also applies in terms of just referring to those people as the victims or a victim is possibly reducing or minimizing kind of possibility?
I don't want to dominate here, but obviously I have so there. Greg's
Go
like,
on,
you go,
Sophie.
you go.
Yeah, that's
Um,
a yes for me.
I think yes, it does, and also no, it doesn't. I think in that there are certain cases there where actually it might work for someone to think of themselves as a victim. That actually might be an important way in which they describe
Mm,
themselves that enables something for them, and that I wouldn't want to kind of assume that that's not a useful word for them. So,
mm,
so I think I'd want to take a step where you're able to see them as a person who has experienced whatever kind of, for example, violence, but that if their language is that I've been a victim of this, to
mm,
respect that. And I can, I feel like I can hear somebody SF in my mind being like, yes, but if you choose to go down the victim language, then you're reinforcing the problem story and not opening up other possibilities. But perhaps this kind of, I don't know, ties to my feeling around that you can, and we've kind of had conversations about this, sort of dance in and out to some degree, to use an amount of language which makes sense to the person you're talking to, and introduce other possible ways of describing things, without having to be sort of too dogmatic about never using problem focused language.
I think that was the thing that came into my head as you were talking, Sophie, was we it's dangerous, isn't it, to say this is language you can never use or should never use, because if that's the language that's right for the person we're talking with, then that is the language we should use. It doesn't mean that we'll use that constantly and stick with that completely. We might still ask questions around it and invite them to see other things or think of themselves in other ways. And I think it's, yeah, I would never want to say to someone, don't ever use this word in your session, because it might be the thing that connects you to that person and to their story.
Mm.
And I think that we would run a risk of kind of creating some distance between us and actually forcing something rather than hearing someone.
What do you think, Ben?
mm. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm wondering whether I'm mulling over that word troublesome right there, if ever used that you picked up on. Words are troublesome. And I wonder, Greg, whether Greg's answer there is partly the reason why, right? Because words can inadvertently create distance like between us. Um, if we select the wrong one or ignore the wrong one. Um, so perhaps that's partly why they're troublesome. Um, yeah, I want to throw that one back to Greg quickly. What do you think Evan's getting at in terms of words are troublesome?
Or no, I suppose it's kind of what you guys have said. I think if we get them, if we don't get them right or we don't use them well, then it causes trouble in the simplest of terms. And I think that means something different for everyone. I mean, we talk in solution focused stuff. I think about like trainings and that, where we talk about acknowledgement and how it's important to echo people's words back to them with, through acknowledging what they're telling us and then ask a question. And there's always that thing of if we don't acknowledge in the right way or we ask a question too soon, we hear more of the same as people are saying, you're not hearing them. Like we're not connected, we're not on the same page. So I've got to keep listening and keep acknowledging or acknowledge in a different way or pick the different words because I mean that's the business we're in, isn't it? And like Sophie said, it is solution focused and it's also in a lot of other areas. What words we pick up on, and like you said, Ben, there, what words we leave out. And we have these choices and we make them quite quickly, don't we? And I think, yeah, it can cause issues if we don't work on them well. Usually, the good thing is if we don't do it well once, we get a reaction, and then we can find another way to acknowledge or ask another question, usually within that moment, so we can still keep that conversation going. Um, but it's just something we have to be mindful of and be careful with, and pay attention to.
Yeah, as you were talking there, I think for me, so since I've been doing solution focused work and since you two have been guiding me and teaching me so beautifully, um, one of the things that I feel like I've really sort of understood more about is the length of the acknowledgement. That I think when I started out, I was much more likely to absolutely sort of, acknowledge when something sounded really, really, really hard, but that there wasn't enough of a beat or a pause in between my acknowledgement in my desire to kind of help to get that person towards where they wanted to go, that I would, for me, perhaps not for them, I don't know, but for me now retrospectively I think I would move on too quickly to sort of asking them how they kind of managed to get through whatever it is they're describing, because when people are sharing stuff with you, that it's all right to have space to hear the thing. You haven't gone completely off track, like using a kind of I don't know, sailing metaphor, not like sail, but that you can tack. If the wind is sort of taking you a little bit off, it doesn't mean that you're not going to arrive at your destination, and it actually might mean that you are a better sailing team, if I can push the metaphor that far, for having just tacked in that slightly different direction because the prevailing wind was actually, look, there is this thing or these things have happened and they have impacted me. And I haven't told anyone about this before, or I don't really have another space to talk about this. So you can adjust your sails, you can acknowledge it and stay off track for longer than perhaps certain sort of approaches or to SF might give you the impression that you're allowed to. And then when it feels right, you can come back to SF. You haven't by staying with the difficulty, you haven't lost your way. You haven't created a problem by giving the problem oxygen. If anything, I would argue that by giving the problem oxygen in a way that is led by the client, you've kind of created that human connection. That's what you said, Greg, that words connect us, that when we get the right words and we share the right words, we feel connected. And that's really powerful. And then when we do ask a question that is more SF, it doesn't feel like somebody hasn't heard you. They have, and because they've heard you, you're more likely to kind of respond in a way that is useful to you to their next question.
I really like the sailing analogy. That's great. I steal that one. Yeah, it reminds me of Reminds me of the UK ASFP accreditation criteria, actually. It's obviously been looking at that recently. I think the wording is it says it wants the overarching theme, I think is the wording used, the overarching theme of the work or the conversation to be in the direction of the client's desired outcomes.
Mm.
Um, you know, but I think there can be twists and turns sort of on that along that journey, can't there? And I think there's quite a consensus now on that sort of acknowledged combination of acknowledgement and possibility, 1 foot in acknowledgement, 1 foot in possibility. And a lot of these conversations feel like fleshing that out more in terms of, how much acknowledgement, what does that acknowledgement look like before moving into possibility? And also keeping in mind that every client is different. And for some, more acknowledgement will be useful, for others, less acknowledgement will be useful. Um, at least that seems to be my current experience. Um, yeah. And what about the other thing you said on reflecting on that quote from Evan was like just paying real careful attention, like to the words that we use. So I'm wondering, like for both of you, what are some of the words that you've been paying careful attention to recently? What are some of the words that you've been mindful of more than others in recent times?
Well, I suppose the two things come to mind. You said that, Ben. So one, like, yes, paying attention to what is important. The other interesting thing is that when we when we start talking to people, and when I first started learning the approach, even if I didn't get the words perfect, it could still be useful. Like, if you can get if your intention is there and like the language is coming and you're on the same page with them and you're connected, even if the wording's not quite 100%, it's still useful for people. So I don't want people to like listen to this and think, "Oh God, I screwed that one word up, and now everything's going to be horribly wrong," because it still works for people. Um,
Mm.
and based on your question, I'm assuming that you're talking about the feelings article about
It
feelings,
could be
and I'm wondering.
anything. Could be anything, yeah.
Uh, I feel like that was a very leading segue, which was very nicely done. And now I'm gonna, Sophie, can you remember the title of the article? Because I can't remember the exact title of the article. I'm going to give
Is this,
due credit.
hang on.
Whilst Sophie said, I just want to add to that, Greg, what you said about like, you can still recover, right? If you use a word or a phrase that doesn't, click with the client or doesn't land well with them. Um, do you remember, I may have shared this before, but do you remember the hammer session that I've shown you in the past that I did? It's a fantastic
Agreed.
example of this.
One of my
Um,
favorites.
yeah, it is one of your favorites because you get to laugh at me when we show it. I was working with a teenage lad who was struggling with various things, and he was describing to me how he'd been in a fight with one of his peers, and at some point along this fight, he had decided that enough was enough. They shouldn't be, you know, fighting each other anymore. And he'd managed to talk the other person round to like, let's stop now. This isn't good for either of us. And he'd managed to sort of win that debate, win that argument of let's stop this. We call it or I call it the hammer session because one of them had a hammer, so it was quite serious, right? Quite a serious fight. And basically, he had managed to win this argument of let's not go that far. Let's not start wielding hammers and really hurting each other. So drawn a boundary and let's not cross it. And I asked the question, and Gregor's going to laugh when I say this. I asked the question, so how did you manage to get the better of him? And in my mind, what I meant was, how did you manage to get the better of him in the argument about whether they should continue fighting or whether they should use the hammer or whatever? But obviously, he took it to mean, well, how did you manage to get the better of him in the fight? So I ended up with this wonderful description of how this lad had got somebody in a headlock and like been punching him in the head and all of this sort of stuff. And I'm just sat there in shock on my face of like, what have I done? Like, what can of worms have I opened up here? Um, but then, as Greg says, like it was, 2 minutes of horrible embarrassment for me as this detailed fight was explained. And then the next question, I was able to kind of recover it and move on to, and how did you manage to draw that boundary and stop the fight from going any further? Right. And we recovered back into that place of him, describing an element of self-control, I guess, in his behavior. So there you go. So yes, you could definitely recover even if you put your foot in it or mix up your words. That's for sure. Yeah.
I found the article, but just before what you were saying there sort of reminds me of I definitely have clients where I ask a very future oriented or sort of best hopes or description of what you would like kind of question, where all that gets described back to me is exactly what they don't want, what is going wrong. And I've been trying to hold on to, I feel like this may be Evan George, I can't remember. I think it's a brief thing that there's no wrong answers, that
Mm.
what what you are receiving from the client is what they need to be telling you in that moment. That they
Mm.
have taken your words and fitted it to what they need to be telling you, and that's what you need to then be responding to. So, I guess maybe that kind of connects to my point from before about sort of allowing that kind of space for that, not what you expected to get, but allowing yourself to, if you can, sort of weave that into, yeah, you definitely don't want any of this because that's obviously making your life a nightmare and you don't want that. What sorts of things would you like to see more of happening?
Mm.
And sometimes actually I work with people and it feels like they can't get to what you want to see more of before you said what you don't want to see. That it feels like too much of a stretch to go into this world in which you're kind of imagining this kind of future outcome. That there are that it's too hard to describe that, and so it needs to be via the kind of problem focused description, and that once you've got that, that can then allow you to say, well, if not that, then what sorts of things would you like to see,
Mm.
going a little bit better? Um,
Yeah. There's a quote from Ensu that we use in training, isn't there, Greg? That's I think she says, all client complaints are useful to listen to because they tell you how the client thinks about what is not working in his or her life and thus what needs to be changed. So it's that
Mm.
hearing it. So it's acknowledgement and possibility again, isn't it? But it's kind of extending that idea a bit further. So hearing those complaints so that you can gently ask, so what is it that you want to be different? What is it that you want instead? Um,
Mm.
yeah.
And yeah, I think and this ties into the emotions thing. I think it's like that's the thing that, in a way, is kind of impossible to teach someone. I think because you can't say you need to hear it for 5 minutes or you need to hear it for 10 minutes before you can move on. It's almost that thing of these are the things to keep in mind while you're listening and hearing things and looking for those opportunities to ask those SF questions or those, like you said, Sophie, what do you want to say instead? Or, so given all that has happened, how would you know a conversation is useful? Like, it's an impossible task to teach someone this is the right time to do it. It's kind of listen for the opportunities, try and get the questions in. But as you said, for one person that could be, 2 minutes in, for others that could be 20 minutes in. It's just an interesting balance to try and hold.
Yeah.
reminds me of something I read recently. I I can't remember who it was now. Someone big and famous anyway. Who was they were talking about probably Evan George. This again the, about
I
the
hope Evan watches this. We've quoted him about 50 times already. There you
I
go.
don't know if you've
Oh
met any Evan George. Um,
well.
so it's about the art of this being art, like an art, and considering it, as a comparison between SF practice, and well, any of the arts. But I think it was talking about improv or
Mm,
acting. That it's a craft, that you learn it, and that it's a kind of a
mm,
responsive thing. So I think if you can't exactly teach it, you can learn it. So if you know what it is that you're trying to do, that you're trying to work with people's words and make that kind of human connection with them, such that their emotions are present. Yeah, hang on, I'm arguing with myself on that one. Or anyway, that you can learn when feels like a fit based on people's reactions, as you said. Kind of, if somebody comes back with a kind of more problem focused description, it may well be because you haven't actually done enough acknowledging and listening to what needs to be heard before that person is prepared to think about things in a different way. So yes, you can learn it.
definitely.
mm,
And I think that's the hard part is learning it because you have to learn it by doing, don't you? And that's
yeah.
just the difficult bit. I think it was it Louis Kaufman, I think, wrote a book called The Solution Focused Tango. And I think we compared it to like that dance, and you have to respond to what the other person is doing and move along with it. And but yeah, sidetrack. So
Mm.
what was you got the article?
Yes. So the article is The Value of Using Emotions in Solution Focused Brief Therapy by Cecil Walker, Adam Ferrer, and Natalia Gourlay Fernandez. And I mean, actually, of course, there's the Eve Lipchick book as well, which
Yeah,
is hugely significant in this. But I found this such a brilliant article. It came, as you two know, at just the right point for me. It was exactly when I needed to be reading this. But it really underlines how, by staying with emotion, allowing emotion to be part of the conversation, you increase the language that you are using that is tailored to and useful to the client. And I think it makes a huge difference to be able to do that.
absolutely. And I don't want to spoil the article for people, but definitely read it because it's useful, I think. You,
I think you
you
could
decide
spoil it.
afterwards.
It's not like a book. It's something
I
you learn
know,
from,
that's
Greg.
true.
You
That's
can
true.
do a little synthesis, and people are like, "Oh, that sounds
I think
good."
the thing that's takeaways that I had from it was that thing of we want to make the social conversation an emotional experience, essentially. And by doing that in just the way that you said, Sophie, by bringing in the language of emotion, like it's an extra bit of things to then help people experience the emotion associated with viewing themselves in like a future with how they are, how they want to be, or when they're remembering how they have been successful in the past at achieving the things they want to achieve. Like you want to connect them with those emotions of those experiences because that is a very useful thing to do. And for some people, that language connects with them more. I feel so. It's another way to invite people to describe the presence of what it is they want. And they give there's some good examples in there and some good sample questions, things like that. And I think there's more science, neuroscience events in there, which I go a bit over my head. I can't remember all those. But yeah, I found it quite. How did I find it? I think I really enjoyed it because I thought, and it's similar to what you guys were saying earlier. I think for me it was Harry Foreman who said, "Look, you don't know what question you've asked until you hear the answer." So even if I say, like, what might you find yourself doing if you were more you had that confidence and motivation that you wanted? And even though I asked about doing, someone might say, well, I would just feel really good. I would just have this great feeling. And so then I'm in that moment of I have a choice of do I go back to my question and say, well, no, we're taught concrete observable behaviors, mostly like external stuff. So I need to say, well, and what might you find yourself doing if you had that feeling? Or can I also ask, okay, so if you had that feeling, like, how would you feel it? That's a weird question, but like, what is that feeling like? How would you describe that feeling to me? And then kind of build that up before trying to then ask, and how would that show to other people? So I think it really, yeah, I find it quite interesting and useful. Kind of, it makes me pay more attention to the language people are using. You know what I mean?
Ben, what
I'm
do
going to
you
see.
take from it?
Yes, go on, Ben. Go on.
Yeah, I mean, um, oh, what do I say? Well, no, I agree and was encouraged with probably 90% of it. I like the idea of using, you know, feeling words as part of as part of creating a rich description, right, of the feature someone wants. I think my, teaching to people has and would be to do both. So to kind of whenever you hear like a feeling description, to then follow that up with an observable, like, how would that show? So how would that happiness show? Yeah, whatever it might be. I think I do prefer the notice question because for me, the notice question gives room for both. It like allows the client to choose whether they want to talk about feelings or whether they want to talk about, process. So when you ask someone, and what would you notice about yourself? I feel like that does give space for someone to talk about how they'd be feeling or how they were feeling. Um, I remember a recent session. I'm going to try and explain this um, in a sort of an anonymous enough way. Um, so I'll just say that their sort of desired outcome was to be sort of living life in a way that was true to themselves. That sort of idea. Um, and they felt that they were a million miles away from that. Really, really feeling rock bottom. And we got sort of halfway through the session, we were exploring some small sort of signs of success and resources. And they described this one moment in their, in their week. And I asked them, when you look back on that, and when you pay attention to how you were in that moment, do you think that you were living life true to yourself? Was that you living life true to yourself? And they sort of paused, and you could feel like and see that emotion, right? The article talks about, you can see and you can feel the emotion from people as they took that in and they reflected upon, yeah, I was living true to myself in that moment. And their response to that was to burst out in just waves of tears, you know, and to sort of just about get out through speech. Yes, I was true to myself in that moment. Um, and the session actually came to a really sort of, for me, slightly strange, but very natural, smooth ending, actually. It was like just this sense of, I think the conversation has kind of got to where it needed to go to. And we did a bit of wrapping up, but it was that kind of light bulb moment, that experience of that's what living true to myself is like, and that's I have experienced that. So I think emotion is very powerful. I can definitely see it as a big part of descriptions. Uh, there were there were some parts of the article um, that I struggled with. That actually, if we talk about emotion, they upset me. I think at the time when I first read it, which might sound quite strong, but I think I just really care about this approach and love how it works for people. So there were parts where I thought, that it felt reckless to me. It felt reckless to me. Some of the parts of it, and I think part of that is because um, I think like feeling language and problem focused talk is much more common to people. Okay, it's much more natural and common to most professionals. So it tends to be more of a go-to. Like when things get difficult in conversations, when things get a bit tricky, people tend to revert to like what they're more comfortable with, right? And I could just see this kind of unlocking or giving permission to to a lot of questions that maybe aren't the best questions for the client, but they're used because we as professionals, practitioners are like naturally more comfortable with that way of working and with those questions. Um, when we deliver training, Greg, you'll know this. Like, we might have spent quite a lot of time with people teaching them loads of different questions, and then we'll sort of encourage them to go away and practice or to demonstrate. And they'll sit down, and the first question that they'll say is, "And how would that make you feel?" Right? Happens super frequently. And Greg and I have never mentioned that question in our training. And yet people are going away from it thinking that's what they've been taught, right? It's somehow ingrained in people. How would that make you feel? How did that make you feel? So I do wonder whether sometimes that question is getting asked because it's ingrained in us, not because it's maybe the best question for the client. Um, yeah, and I'll come on to it later because I'm just going to go off on a super big rant now. But yeah, let me pause there. What did you guys love about it? Let's start with that. What did you love about the article? What were the parts that got you excited about it?
Well, now I need to. I can't go on to what I loved about it
Yeah,
because
yeah.
I'm going to
You
think
can't
about
do
what you
that to
just
us
said.
then.
Yeah, you can't just be like, oh, that's like, yeah. I think that's my initial reaction. No, I would agree with you that I suppose the way it was explained, from my perspective, I didn't feel that it was reckless. I suppose I can see the danger in what you're saying of like we don't want to because when you say one thing to people in training and then as you say they take their own thoughts away with them because that's
Mm,
what we all do. If there is a question about feelings, it's not used in that way of like, oh, I went through this terrible experience and then asking someone, oh, how did that make you feel? Like we don't want that to be the question because that's the worrying bit, isn't it? Whereas
mm.
if it's
I see
because
that's the
I
part
suppose
of the article that upset me though. I think they were
mm,
hinting at maybe we can do that. Maybe we can ask about negative emotions and use negative emotions.
I
Yeah.
think yeah, I mean that would be a line probably for me in terms of feeling uncomfortable going into that. But I suppose if you're confident in your skills and like there's a reason you're doing that, not to. I suppose I'd be curious about the intention of that. Like, are you asking that to then say, and how would you hope to be feeling then instead when you come across something similar? If you're gonna move that more towards how people want to be or how they've been in the past, whether it like fits with how they want to be in the future. That's one thing. But if you're not, just to have people experience that as a contrast, I'd probably avoid that from my current practice.
Yeah. I mean that was my understanding. I could be completely wrong, let's be honest, but my understanding reading it was that using so the word they used was using negative emotion rather than just acknowledging it. So they noted that, in solution focused, we acknowledge and then, you know, go towards possibility. And essentially they were arguing that rather than just acknowledging negative emotion, we can use it in solution focused brief therapy. And I think my understanding of what I was reading is they were saying it can provide like a counterpoint to somebody's hopes or desired outcome, right? So the more that you kind of hear and experience and use negative emotion and negative experience, that somehow that helps with change because you've got this counterpoint to where you actually want to get to. Yeah. Yeah, go on, Sophie.
I was going to say, I don't think that wasn't what I got from it. The more that you use this, the more it can help. My sense, what they were trying to say is, look, there are ways in which SF has been done. And for the most part, recent SF approaches have not been interested in including emotion, indeed, have seen it as either not relevant or potentially problematic. So, my sense of the article was to say this is an area that could be really useful for SF practitioners. If you're using this for the client, it can be useful. And I think they're sort of the way that they were describing sort of using negative emotion was actually a very small part of the article. Like most of it is how you talk about the positive emotion, how you invite people to kind of have a richer description of their positive emotions. Because I remember when was reading it, I was sort of struggling with this kind of sense of how much of the kind of negative emotion am I allowed to enter into this conversation and still be working in an SF way. So it didn't give me the permission that I was sort of not wondering about when I was reading it. So I had a different take that they weren't really inviting that. But to your point, that I think what they are sort of trying to invite us to be is not be negative emotion phobic, to see negative emotion as a source of information, like anything is a source of information. It's just another kind of language. And in the same way as we don't get particularly stuck on anything in SF, right? If even you move on, even if it's kind of different time perspectives or different other people's perspectives or different location perspectives, you move on. You don't stay in a description of one thing. And I think this was an invitation to say, look, if somebody is bringing this thing for you, it's a source of information. You can explore them a bit with them. It will contain information. If somebody does not want to be anxious, there's definitely something they want to be instead, and that perhaps, I mean, I think I would quite quickly move on from if you don't want to feel anxious, what do you want to feel? What do you want to feel more of? But it's kind of more of an invitation that if that anxiety or that problem sort of focused negative emotion is more present, that you don't have to kind of fence it off and say that is not what we're doing here. You can say, what's useful to you in this? If we just stay a little bit longer, what's useful? And as soon as you have that sense of, you can now ask the kind of question that invites somebody to describe what else they might like to be feeling, and then what that feels like, where that is in their body, etc. Then you're using it as a springboard rather than something that you can't touch with a barge pole.
And there's a
Yeah.
difference there,
Okay.
isn't there, in terms of hearing what people are saying, going with them for a bit into that conversation, as opposed to that's the first thing I need to do is hear about their problem, understand how it made them feel before I can move on. Like, I don't, like, it's still that focus of what can I use to springboard into where you want to go.
What do you
So
think,
again,
Ben?
go on.
This is really unlike me. I normally just try and steer away from any disagreements at all. But I think like well, I think we're kind of agreeing in some respects because I think I said at the start like 90% of this article really liked would apply, and I think that's the sort of like positive emotion description, using that in description, completely on board with. They give a okay, well three things that you can respond, and then I'll I'll stop for now.
Go on.
So okay, so first one, um, I wonder where this fits with um, preferred future conversations that are about the client's ability to, overcome challenges in spite of negative emotion. Okay. So some of the richest conversations I've seen are around, so how will you know that you're still moving forward despite those negative emotions? Or even past conversations. How did you manage to overcome that despite feeling terrible, X, Y, and Z? Second point, I think the client is king, right, in terms of steering the
Or Queen?
conversation. Or queen, king or queen, indeed. Good point, Sophie. Um, and there's a point in the article where I'm just going to find it because I don't want to misquote it. But so they're looking at a transcript, okay, and the therapist is Berg, which I'm assuming is uh, Insu. And there's this one comment that says we're on page 8. Okay. So the client, the mum, says, I'll be able to make decisions, is her answer. And the comment from the authors says, although a perfectly acceptable question and obviously one that is consistent with SFBT, there is a shift to cognitive process. i.e., making decisions, and the conversation about feelings has diminished. And I was just a bit confused at that, kept looking at it. And then I went back to, well, what was the question that the therapist asked before that answer? And it seems to be, so after this miracle has happened, the problems were all solved. What would be different in your gut feeling? That's what the therapist asks. What would be different in your gut feeling? And then the client's answer is, well, I'll be able to make decisions. And for me, that's where you go because it's where the client's taken it. It's the reverse of what you were describing, Greg, where, maybe you ask someone about what would you be doing, and they say, well, I'd be feeling happier, right? And this is saying, well, what would be different about your feeling? And they say, I'll be able to make decisions. And for me, it's about the trump card is the client and letting the client lead rather than trying to steer it, one way or another. So that would be my second point.
Can
And then
I,
yeah,
just
go on,
before you
Sophie.
make your third point,
Yeah,
could I just say that there are two different answers there? There's a mum and a dad. And the mum
yeah,
says, being able to make decisions. And the dad previously says, maybe I'd feel a little lighter, a little easier to move. So you've got two languages there. I'd feel a bit lighter. I'd be able to make decisions. So I think for me, this is about the author's kind of decision in that this transcript to say, well, look, I'm illustrating emotion, so I'm going to stick with, I'm going to move into that space of like, what would feeling a little bit lighter be like? It's like one of those kind of like constant points in which somebody says something and you have so many questions that come off that, and you kind of have to make a decision about what's going to be the most useful next question to that person. Do you get it right? Who knows? But that you do actually have to select from things. And I think for me, their point there is one of your possible options can be go more into asking them more about the feeling that they're describing. So when you are reviewing possible directions, allow the description of emotion to be a possible response from your, or a possible way in which you build a question.
yeah, yeah. I guess there's lots of options, are there? I mean, to me, it read, I think, what was the word I used earlier? I said reckless, right? And I think it was like, I think my feeling was that if somebody who is experienced in solution focus reads this article, it's going to be brilliant. If someone is new to the therapy or learning it, it could really lead them astray, was my feeling with it. And I read that as, because if read the comments, oh, what's now? But it came across to me as though they were saying the therapist's choice of question had steered the conversation towards cognitive process. But the therapist had asked about feelings, and then the client had chosen, or at least one of the clients had chosen to steer it towards cognitive process. So and quite possibly that's me misreading it, but guess I was thinking if that's how I've interpreted that, then there's every chance, other people would as well. Um, and then the third and final one, I'm conscious of time and me going off on a rant, but they give an example or a suggested example of using negative emotion. This is in page 13, I think. Yeah, page 13. And the example they give is that the client describes getting out of bed in the morning as being like climbing Mount Everest. So the example is the client comes and they say getting out of bed in the morning is like climbing Mount Everest. Yeah. Now, if I was teaching someone solution focus, I would teach acknowledgement and possibility. So I would teach acknowledgement of that. So getting out of bed in the morning is like climbing Mount Everest for you. Given that it's like that, how do you manage? How did you manage to get out of bed this morning, given that it's like climbing Mount Everest? Yeah, so acknowledgement and possibility. What they're saying here is not only can you bring in acknowledgement and possibility, but you can also use negative emotion. And the example they've given is, wow, that sounds so difficult. You are so depressed. Everything is so hard that even getting out of bed is like climbing Mount Everest. And yet, despite how hard even the smallest things are for you right now, you are not only able to get out of bed, but make it all the way here, sitting here with me, an incredible feat. How did you manage to do that? And for me personally, there's too much addition from the therapist in that response. So things like saying you are so depressed feels like, an opinion or an analysis from the therapist. Things like saying even the smallest things, are hard for you right now. Well, who's to say that is a small thing for that person? Might be a massive thing for them. Um, yeah, and then even the incredible feats part. It was an incredible feat to get here today. There's for me um, that there's too much input from the therapist there in terms of adding in their own opinion and their own analysis. And I don't see, this is quite strong for me, but I'll put my line in the sand. Um, I don't see how that is adding in a helpful way to acknowledgement and possibility.
Oh, you're on mute.
No doubt. I suppose thinking about, I struggle to do more than one thing at once. So I was looking for the article and trying to listen, and I can't do both. So I didn't see it in the article. I think one of the things that makes me think of is one that's probably a very brief, like, excerpt of a bigger session. I would agree with you, Ben, that if that is me bringing stuff in, that wouldn't sit well with my style. At the same time, if that's the language that's been built up in terms of talking to them, like, I'm feeling really depressed, and even little things are really difficult, then I might echo back some of that language if that's what's been given to me. I think certainly from my standpoint, I wouldn't feel comfortable adding those things in, and I wouldn't advocate for that. And I suppose it's that thing of, if that's the language being used, and you try asking someone to imagine a future for 10 questions or the past 10, 15 minutes, and that's all you're getting is that language, then absolutely, I think I'd stick with the words that are given to me, but in an attempt to acknowledge and invite some sense of possibility. So how did you even get up this morning and get here? So I suppose I wouldn't do that personally because that wouldn't fit with my style. And I wouldn't, I think that's the bit where you can get it wrong as well, or increase someone's feelings of, depression or feeling low or not being able to do things. So I think it is a very delicate, troublesome balance, I suppose, in terms of managing that. Um, I think there's going to be a lot in terms of individual styles, because I think of things like, I'm watching videos of Insu and how many times she would say, wow. Like, I could never get away with saying, wow. I would come across as like the most patronizing person in the world because that's not naturally me. But I think that totally fit for her. And the same with like learning from the guys from Brief, or like watching Elliot Connie, and you're like, I can't, I try and steal bits, but I can't be those people. Like, I've got to be me. And I think it's juggling that. So like listening to the language and being true to kind of who I am as a person while respecting their language and still not being, I suppose, like you said earlier, Sophie, I don't want to be afraid of that language. If that's what someone's talking about and giving me, I'm not going to dwell in it any longer than I feel I need to in terms of that acknowledgement. But if that's what's being given to me and that's where that person's at, I feel like that's where I need to start. That makes sense. don't know if that answers your point anyway, or that's just me random, but those are the thoughts and things in my mind.
Yeah, I I really I really connect with that. And I can see, Ben, where your concern is. And I think I agree with Greg that what's happened in this paragraph is a very brief description of the client's language, and then an apparent sort of therapist building on that. But I don't think it is the therapy. I think that's just us not having seen the full context. So, for example, just before it does say a client may share how depressed they've been. So, for example, that little bit has been, we know that this client has said, I've been really depressed. So when you say when the therapist kind of echoes back in that suggestion that you've been depressed, it is an echoing of the language. And I agree with Greg. I think that there is something about individual style, because I feel like I've done a lot of SFU training and I haven't seen Natalia, but I've seen Cecil Walker and I have seen Adam Ferreira and how they talk, and I can hear their voices in that kind of I don't know that it's American particularly, but there is something sort of like so engaged in a way that like the wow. If I try and do that, I mean, I sound ridiculous to myself. I can't sort of do that sort of engagement because it's not me. I have my own ways of acknowledging in that way. I think that you're concerned about the therapist adding things is valid if the therapist is adding things, but I think that's just we haven't got the full, because it's a shorter example, we haven't got the full previous language. So they haven't kind of shown you, look, this is a like for like. And I know how passionate they are about using the language and not introducing things. So I think that that's just a kind of, that we're missing a little bit of information there. But also, you're concerned about if somebody is sort of learning to do SF and they read this and they kind of they think that they can kind of like add things or need to sort of stay in the negative in that way. I think I basically don't want you to worry, because I think if anyone is reading this article, it's because they're really thinking about their SF practice. It doesn't seem like an article. It seems to me like an article that is inviting the SF practitioner world, who might also be involved in training and writing, to be thinking about emotions. So I think the audience isn't necessarily therapists or practitioners who don't really kind of have a sense of what the broad overview of SF is. It's a kind of trying to act as a kind of corrective. And even if, let's say, there's an infelicity of the therapist bringing some stuff in, and I mean, I have certainly committed a few of those infelicities myself. So even if that is that there, it's not irreparable, because you have still acknowledged and asked them about their strengths. How did you manage to make it here? So already in the second step of that, like, given how hard it is, you still managed to do this. Like, how did you manage to do that? Is already there. There aren't other therapies that ask you that. So you're not heading down a different therapeutic route, as long as you have that two-step piece. As long as you move to kind of real sort of resource talk. Maybe there are other therapies, but none that are coming to mind, which specifically think about your strengths and your resources in that way in order to move forward. Are you reassured?
Yeah.
Go on,
Yeah, I
Dan. What
think
do you think?
oh sorry. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I get on board with that. I guess yeah, I just feel like, are we trying to add something here that doesn't need to be added? And to clarify again, 90% of the positive emotion description stuff I'm on board with. It's the using of negative emotion that I'm sort of being some resistant to, and allow myself to speak on that. And I think it's the line, um, yeah. So there you go. So one of the lines that I think encapsulates this is, they say, instead of only listening to or acknowledging this, the SFBT therapist can use this problem description and the negative emotion underlying it to facilitate change. So it's this idea of using problem description and using negative emotion. That is, um, I think there's two things. So one, I'm wondering whether um, actually in practice are we just talking about acknowledgement and possibility, in which case we already have that. Okay, and are we trying to create and name something else that we already have? That whole given how difficult things are, how did you manage it? Or if it's something else, if it's something else about using problem description and negative emotion, that's where I'm feeling caution. Um, yeah, and that's where I'm feeling uncertain about this. Yeah.
Be interesting to hear more about that intention and how that negative emotion might be used. I suppose. I feel like I think about I don't know. I think about like working with families and stuff, and sometimes talking about problems and the challenges and everything else is a really useful point to contrast to. Like I'm not actively trying to do it, but if that's where the conversation keeps going, then bringing that in can be quite useful. So you've been able to say, okay, so we're talking about the argument you had over the weekend and how that was really stressful. And you don't like it, you don't want that to happen again. Like, even if you had another disagreement or argument, like how would you hope to be sort of feeling instead when you're turning that around next time that happens? So I don't know that I'm naming that emotion, but if they're telling me what that emotion is, then I can use that as a counterpoint to say, what do you want instead? That makes sense. I don't know if that's the same thing. It's been a little while since I've read the article. Um, but I feel like it's one of those things I'm not going to encourage and try and dig for. But if it's there, I'm going to use that language to then kind of build on, if that makes any sense. Because for some people, I suppose for me, I'm a very practical, like pragmatic person. If that language of that emotion is really useful for that person, then I'm going to try and use that. But if the language of doing an action and noticing and seeing it connects with them more, then I'm going to probably use a lot more of that. But it's good to have the awareness in both, because I think, like Sophie said, emotion isn't always valued or isn't talked about. Even though I watched that um, seminar, webinar thing that Susanna Stovall did, Sophie, and that was really good because they made a comment about how you read books that people write and that it's all questions and practical bits. But what you see them do in sessions is far more laden with emotion and like holding people and the things that they do. So it's there, but people don't talk about it. So I think this kind of makes it more tangible and more, let's talk about this and make this, I suppose, let's use it wisely and be aware of it. Because if we're not aware of it and talking about it, we're missing it, which is probably more of a shame if that means we're not doing as useful as we could basically.
Mm. And it makes me think of um, like if the conversation is like tennis match, and I feel like we've had a version of this conversation before, but if the conversation's a tennis match, it's about sort of if the ball that comes over is I'm feeling depressed, for example. I think the invitation here in terms of using the negative emotion is not to kind of sort of deflect what's happened with a kind of acknowledge and possibility in a kind of smooth move. Yes, given how difficult things have been, how have you managed to cope? But allowing yourself to go like to catch it just for a moment. And I don't know, there's an invitation to kind of like just never throw the ball back, but just to say, to really name it. So as they say there, it sounds really difficult. So you described you're feeling really depressed and even just doing, some of the smallest things are incredibly hard. So given that, like, how have you managed to keep on going rather than I think there's something in the acknowledge and possibility that makes you feel that this is a 1-2 move. that it goes very quickly, that you can absolutely acknowledge that something's difficult, but it's very important not to stay with that, even for the time it takes to say that language back to that person to show that you've really understood before you invite them into considering things from a different perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with that at all. I think that's, I think as you guys have probably touched on and figured out already, possibly one of the challenges with this passage is the lack of the full transcript, right? Because it's reading as it reads. If you just take it at surface value, we don't know where those comments have come from. So if they have come from the client themselves, then I'm much more on board in terms of feeding it back to them. Um, I think, my worry and my caution is that there'll be people who read that who don't see the context and come away with the impression that it's okay to add those things in yourself rather than feeding back the client's language, to make the assessment that somebody is really depressed and to tell them you're really depressed. Um, that's where the kind of caution comes from. Um, and I think there's probably work to be done, isn't there, in terms of defining again, because it's like still to me it's still that acknowledgement possibility. But as you beautifully described, Sophie, it's about how long you hold on to that for and how much attention you give to that acknowledgement before then passing it on. Um, and I think, the red line for me is going down the line of asking questions about the negative emotions, right? So asking about people's worthlessness or how awful they feel. That for me is a red line. Maybe there's probably lots of people out there who disagree. Um, and so I think that's what I'm worried about. I'm worried that this article might give people the impression that that's okay to do, like to start investigating the negative emotions rather than giving them, whatever we want to call it, like breathing space, room, holding on to it for a while, naming it, and then moving on. That's kind of where the line is drawn for me.
I feel like we need a, well, I need to reread that last bit of the article. And then I feel like we might need an email to Adam and Cecil and is it, what was the author's
Natalia.
name? Natalia. Might need an email to them just to say, could you guys give us a little bit more or tell us a little bit more about this? I'm really curious to hear it. And then have a follow-up conversation.
Yeah.
Get them on the podcast.
Yeah,
Could
yeah,
do.
let's do it.
Could do. Like they probably talk about their own article better than we did.
Yeah, I think so. There
Uh,
you go. Well, given that we started by talking about being hypersensitive and we talked about topic of emotions, I think it was okay to let rip a little bit on some stuff. But yeah, that would be good to hear their views, wouldn't it? To come back on that. Um, I think I'm sensitive as well because of the number of times, Greg, we've heard someone ask, "And how would that make you feel?" It's just never ending. Yeah.
yeah. I've had people use it almost as sort of like a difference question. It's like if you notice
Mm.
that, rather than say what difference would that make, say, oh, how would that make you feel? And yeah, usually it's done in like the right sort of direction of encouraging and amplifying that good thing that they want to have. And I don't think I've had to tell anyone off or tell them, you know, don't ever do that, never ask that question again. But yeah, just to explain the kind of how it's a good learning point because it's like that thing of how to use that question if you're going to use it. Because I think people do, and it can still be useful. It's just about using it wisely and well. I think Ben disagrees. I love this. I love Ben
I
disagreeing.
just I just want to turn it around on you. Is there anything wrong with doing that?
There's anything wrong with doing that? Um, I think the danger we talked about one of like I think within the negative space, but I think also like as we were talking, I remember being on the training. It wasn't a solution focused one, but it was a controversial topic. And the trainers did this thing where they were really conscious and lovely people to look after us, but they're doing like the logical teaching bits, and then kind of we do an exercise, and then they check in with the group, right? How are you all feeling right now? And I found that really, like, I know they were doing sport, but I found that really jarring because I'm in like my logical space, like thinking of the things and how that affects my practice and how I am and what I do. And I'm like, I'm not in the feeling space at all. Like I'm in the thinking space. So I could see, like, if it's my agenda to ask someone every time how they feel when they're like, what are you talking about? I just want to be able to make decisions. Like I just want to be able to do this or do this thing. Like I want to talk about my actions or my thinking. Feelings isn't what I'm here for. Then I think I would avoid doing that because you'll get a sense from people and their responses that like that doesn't make sense for them and they don't want to. That's not their language. It's not the kind of language they use. So I would say, yeah, just look out for the responses you get.
There are some questions that are because I'm just questioning myself now. This is like maybe we should be going and asking that question much more often. But I'm thinking there's like three categories of questions in terms of I'm just thinking out loud here. Like feelings one, so how would that make you feel or how did that make you feel? There's ones that are purely like action behavioral based, like what would you be doing? What did you do? Or maybe how would that show? Maybe is a bit closer to that. Um, and then there's some that at least feel to me like they do open up both. So I mentioned the notice question before. So what do you notice about yourself? I think gives the possibility to answer both ways. Um, and does the difference question do that as well? So if you ask what difference would that make, can people answer with feeling and or action? So there are some questions that give a wider remit of answer. Would that be fair to say?
I
I
think
think, yeah, that's open.
it is fair to say, but just to kind of bring it back to the idea that you need to know what your options are when you're asking those questions, is that
Mm,
the way that I think a lot of people are trained currently is to move it into the behavioral space. So that if you're answering a wide question and you get an emotion answer, your invitation at the moment, I mean, very broadly, I think that's definitely changing, but your invitation is to bring it back to the observable. What would you be doing? What would other people notice, right? And I think that this is an invitation to say, yeah, sure, keep it broad, but if they haven't described how they're feeling, as I'd be walking down the street, kind of feeling feeling more confident, that you can also ask a question: where would you be feeling the confidence in your body? And then you've made that a richer description. So what does that look like? It might be, shoulders back, making eye contact with people, but what does it feel like on the inside as well? That if you don't offer people the opportunity to describe their emotional experience, which is consistent with the future that they would like to be experiencing, which you will experience emotionally because we're humans, then you've limited your effectiveness as a question asker in that session. Can
And
I
I
also
think
just pause and say I'm so sorry, I'm going to have to go because
you're,
I've got a session at 4.
Yeah.
I think the only thing that makes me think of is there are also those questions about when people say about their thoughts. Like I wouldn't have racing thoughts or things like that. You can ask, what would you be noticing about your thoughts instead? So I feel like I'm paying attention to the language we receive. That opens up more. It gives us more options for people to notice things. Like so, we always talk about the signs moving forward or being in that future. If people are living it, we want them to have these tangible, really small, like noticeable things as waypoints almost. I think I've heard from the guys that group that it's waypoints along the way that tell you when you're in the right direction. So if we're covering all bases around feelings or things they might be doing, like it's more options, it's more things to notice. So it's all more things to pull them into that future. So I think that's the other bit of the article that's really useful because it just gives more signs for people along the way to say, I'm moving in the right direction here. I'm making progress.
Hopefully, we better let you go. But thanks so much. Obviously,
Thank you.
well, predictably, the most insightful, best reflections have come from yourself. So people can look forward to listening to those.
I mean,
Yeah, and we'll
I
catch
think
up
we've
again
all
soon.
contributed equally, Ben.
No, we love. Well, I love hearing from you. It's awesome. Yeah, feel like I'm learning from you all the time. So thank
I
you.
feel great.
Awesome.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Okay. Have
Bye.
a great day.
You
Bye.
too.